Welcome to Top Team Talk. Again, my name is Abu Chaudhry. I'm a pulmonary critical care physician. The whole point of this is to kind of combine combat sports to health and wellness. And as our kind of mission statement is that we do truth above all else and get the highest level of people across the different disciplines to come talk to us about what they do and some questions about how it kind of interplays into, life in general, wellness, etc. So today we have a special treat. We have Ernesto Rivera, internationally ranked Jiu-Jitsu no-gi, 14-year Jiu-Jitsu training, 5 years of black belt, originally from Venezuela, came to the U.S., lived in Miami, close to my hometown, went to FIU, now is in finance, and you're very well accomplished from a professional standpoint, but you still compete at a super high level from Jiu-Jitsu. And before we kind of get into all that, like, what drives you to compete at that level?
Yeah, I think mainly, like, if I think of personally, like, one underlying thing that kind of defines me is self-improvement, and professionally or within jiu-jitsu. And I think if you're going to spend, 7 days a week training jiu-jitsu a couple times a day, what's the difference between training at a high level and competing at a high level and doing it at a lesser level? And so it's going to take the same amount of time. And so if you're going to do it, you have to put in my opinion, you should put in your maximum effort. And then what that'll yield is you'll do it, to the best of your ability. And for some folks, that may be never competing. And for some folks, it's, competing across the world. And so, yeah, I just think if you're going to do it, you're going to spend the time, put 100% effort while you're in it, and then that'll yield you some good results.
I wish more people had that mentality with all aspects of their life. Like, if you're going to do something, do it right. I remember my mom, when I was a kid, she was like, my dad was like, you have to be a doctor, you have to be a doctor. My mom was like, I don't care what you are, but you got to be the best at it. If you're like, whatever thing you choose, like, you go all in, and the success will come.
Yeah.
So you found that jiu-jitsu translated that, because I know you were practicing before you kind of went into the whole, finance world. Do you think that jiu-jitsu gave you that resilience to push through all that kind of stuff, or?
Yeah, I think it starts earlier than that, right? Like, you're familiar with this, like, immigrant parents, like, I understand what it was to, like, kind of watch them struggle, but jiu-jitsu is, in a lot of ways, it boils down kind of how hard it is to get good at something into something that's very easy to understand, because you're fighting against somebody else, right?
Right.
Which is the same thing you're doing at your job and my job and in real life, right? And so it's just a condensed version of life in a lot of ways, I think. And if you treat it that way, it just shows you, like, oh, well, if I can be good at this thing, anything else can, you just put the time in.
It's funny you mentioned immigrant parents. I'm a child of immigrant parents as well. And, I have a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old. And the hardest thing that I find is that, I saw my dad struggle. I saw my mom struggle. I remember, like, my mom didn't have like 35 cents to get an orange. And I know because she tells me that story all the time, right? But now, like, my kids, they have a lot, right? They have the ability to have a want for nothing. And it's a lot harder to teach them to be emotionally resilient than I feel like me and my brothers and sisters, because we learn through life experiences, but then we have to kind of, like, tell them, like, hey, you have to be resilient. They're like, we know what you're talking about.
You end up taking away things that, or not taking away, but kind of posing challenges through other things, because life is good for them, right?
Yeah, so, like, you try, but then they don't understand. Like, why are you withholding something that you have?
Like, I know you can.
I know you can, but you choose not to, right? And I think that's the hardest part, and that's why I think martial arts is the answer to that for my kids. And I was telling Professor Matos this in our last episode, is like, with my son coming to jiu-jitsu, like, I found him getting, to a point where he thought he was good at it, then he wasn't, then getting tapped and not, et cetera, and then kind of moving up. That kind of instilled that forced resilience, and now he's so much more disciplined than he was before. And I think that has to start young, and it has to keep going, especially if, we live in a society where most households have a TV, there's enough, resources, but again, there's a lot of people that are suffering, and we don't want to take away from that. But there are also a lot of people who have, and they have to kind of build this resilience in these kids.
For sure.
And how do you do that? So when you look at, there's a question I asked Professor Matos. What do you think is better? And you are the top, or the coach for no-gi at American Top Team Sandy Springs. You've taught some of pretty elite people, and you have colleagues that are going to NFC, UFC, et cetera. What do you think is better, no-gi or gi?
So the way that I think about this is, like, even if you think of a regular gym where you just can work out in,
Yeah.
that's intimidating for a lot of people.
Right.
And those machines don't even fight back, right?
Right.
Like you just go and lift weights. So when you walk into like a MMA jiu-jitsu gym, it's going to be an intimidating experience for most people, unless you have experience.
Yeah.
And so the way that I mostly tell people is like, when you walk in, whatever scares you less, go do that, right? And a lot of times it'll depend when you walk in. You know what I mean? Because if you walk in the
Sparring session,
right,
yeah,
exactly.
it's like, yeah.
Well, I'm not doing the thing with no-gi because that looks really scary.
Or
So let me put
seeing
this
somebody
thing on.
get choked out, you know, you're like, oh man.
And
like,
so
yeah.
I just tell people like whatever seems less scary in that moment, because that'll make you stay and at least try it.
That's
you know?
an interesting perspective.
And
yeah.
you know, obviously, like I teach no-gi here. I've done both for a really long time. No-gi is a little bit of a less barrier entry in that you can just wear shorts and a t-shirt.
Yeah.
But then in a lot of ways, I think a lot of people can see it, and it seems more like of an athletic endeavor because you're not wearing, you know, a kimono, you don't have a belt on, so it seems less like a martial art
Right.
at first. You're like, well, what am I getting into, right? Like people
Right.
are moving fast. It's very obviously sweaty. Whereas
Right.
when you're wearing a gi, you've seen karate movies, right?
Yeah,
Even if it's not karate.
right.
And so you understand
Yeah.
like, okay, this is a martial art. We're going to do a class. They're going to teach me a thing.
You almost like get in the zone.
You
right?
understand
You're
what's happening,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So, you know, you have a rubric for how to think of that.
Right.
Whereas I think for no-gi, it kind of looks like tussling, you know?
Yeah.
And so because you don't have a rubric, I think for a lot of people, inexperienced women, of, you know, children, young, whatever, they're like, man, I don't know what this is, right? I don't know how to
Right,
think about
right.
this. And the gi can be a thing where like, oh, this is a martial art. It seems all very organized.
Right.
And so, but yeah, whatever scares you less, I think.
It seems like there's been a shift in the amount of hype that's going out because like there's a lot of like, especially with Abu Dhabi, ADCC,
Yeah.
like there's a lot of push for no-gi, you know, competition, and you know there's a lot of this, you know, in the Twitterverse of things. There's a lot of hatred towards like the, you know, how original competitions were and like how things are evolving.
Yeah.
And some people like ADCC because it's, you know, constant movement and,
Yeah.
or submission only grappling. What are your thoughts on that kind of evolution? I feel like it's kind of like they want the entertainment and you're sacrificing. This is my personal opinion.
Yeah.
But again, I mean, you know better than I do. Like, what's the right way moving forward?
Yeah, in terms of competition, I think, you know, you started as Jiu-Jitsu was trying to prove itself through the UFC and UFC 1 of like, hey, this is a viable martial art. And in UFC 1, you figured that out immediately, right? Because you had somebody who was 185 pounds defeating larger opponents. And so that was kind of proven. And then over time, especially over the last, call it 10 years, it's like, all right, how do we make this a sport that people who not only participate, but people who don't participate will watch? And so I think that's why no-gi is really palatable because, again, the rules are easy to understand. They're not wearing a weird thing if you haven't seen it before, right? Or a thing where you think, like, how does that affect what they're doing?
Right.
And so I think in an effort for organizers really to make money and to make this for audiences who don't practice, they said, all right, how do we boil this down to a simple rule set, really, that doesn't have all these technicalities and that somebody who's, maybe they did it once or they heard about it or their cousin did it, they can sit down and be like, all right, I understand what's going on here. These guys are going to try to strangle each other and maybe it'll be fun, you know? And I do think, though, like the whole like geared towards submission only because that will be exciting is a little bit of like it's an incorrect conclusion, I think, because when you go to the highest level and you say, all right, this is submission only, basically what you're saying is like if you were doing a boxing match and you were going to say, all right, here's what's going to happen. None of you can throw jabs. You can only throw overhand rights, right? You can only try to knock each other out.
Right.
So what ends up happening is like no one throws anything.
Right.
Right? Or you throw like a couple of shots, right?
And it's like,
because if you mess up,
you
the
might
fight's
get stuck.
right.
Yeah.
And so I think there's some happy medium, and that's why ADC is so popular because they do, you know, the first half is no points, the second half is points.
Right.
And so you have that period of like, all right, you know, go for it, and then after that, hey, try to score some points, which is inherently less risky.
Right.
And then the match will open up, and you see it. Like ADCC is the most exciting rule set, at least right now. So
right.
They have.
That's a great point, though. I didn't see that perspective, but I definitely see it now. You know, like you're right. You're handicapping people of their toolbox. And hey, look, you can only use these tools.
Yeah.
And now you have to be creative. Now people are coming up with very interesting types of submissions.
Yeah.
And so I guess it makes it exciting, but it does take away a lot of technical ability for someone to actually win that fight. Now, when it comes to, you know, the world of no-gi, this is a personal question. How do you assess if like someone is a white belt, a blue belt, a purple belt, a black belt, if they never put on the gi?
Yeah, so it's an interesting conversation. I think, so in a school where, say there's two programs, gi and no gi, in general, I think you should, whoever the instructors are, if it's not the same, you should have a conversation of how you're going to rank your students. And I don't think you should limit folks by saying, hey, you have to put the gi on in order to rank up, because it's kind of silly if you think about it. And the reason is, like, say someone only does no gi, right? And they train for 6 years and they're incredible. For you to call somebody a white belt that's doing that, that doesn't make any sense, right? Because if somebody walks through that door and they're like, all right, this is a white belt.
Yeah.
Like, no, he's not. Like, very clearly this guy's good, right?
Yeah.
And so I just think it depends. If somebody comes in and they, hey, I want to be a no-gi practitioner. All right, fantastic. Then we'll rank you up as a no-gi practitioner. And luckily, the skills translate both ways.
That's what I was wondering. Like, I mean, I haven't had much of experience. I recently got into, jiu-jitsu, as you know. But it seems like if you don't know how to use the grips, like if you've never gripped or, baseball chokes or et cetera, like, and let's say you go against like a good blue belt and you're a black belt in no-gi only, and he like gets you with some, some just to be able to grip and do some chokes that way. I feel like, how can you make them equal? Maybe this, it's kind of confusing.
The parallel that I would draw in the past, people would say you can go from gi to no gi, but you can't do the inverse, right? That was the kind of overarching wisdom that kind of lived for a long time.
Yeah.
I think the better comparison is two people who speak the same language. Say we both speak Spanish, but you're from Spain and I'm from Chile.
Yeah.
Right? We speak the same language.
Right.
But if you speak in your local dialect and I speak in mine, like, hold on.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And if I'm forced to speak in yours, I'm going to be lost, and the other way I'm going to be lost.
Right.
But if I do it for, I don't know, a month, 2, 3, 4,
you probably figure it out.
It's fine.
Yeah.
Right? And if somebody is, just as an example, like someone's a linguist and they're from Chile, and the other guy is a regular person, the linguist will do better in both. He's just better.
He's just better, yeah.
And you see it now, right? Like, you see people who are really high level in the gi, and they go to no gi, and it's like no problem. The other way is less common now because the gi's not as popular.
Right.
But I have a suspicion that if it was, they would transition just
You
fine.
started with the gi first, right? And competed and then transitioned to no gi.
Yeah.
What made you transition? Like, why not stay high level in the gi?
Yeah, honestly, a couple of reasons. One, in Atlanta, I think that it was a virtue of where I was. So I moved to Atlanta, and I think the no-gi here was just better at the time. Not that the gi is not high level, but I think it was just better. Two, I hadn't really trained it, and it felt like a deficiency, right? Like, I considered myself a good black belt, but I basically only trained in the gi. And so if I was training with, like, just to be honest, a tough, competitive purple or brown belt who only did no gi, very good match, right?
Wow.
Like, that's just real. And because no-gi, because you don't have the grips, it's faster, it's more athletic, it's sharper in a lot of ways, levels even out, right? And so somebody who is a decent purple belt, he can go against a good black belt and it could be a good match. And so to me, it felt like, oh man, I'm doing myself a disservice. And then it's just fun. Like, it's just fun.
Yeah, and you don't have less laundry, I guess, right?
Less laundry, slightly.
Maybe slightly less laundry,
and your fingers hurt less.
Yeah, fingers hurt less for sure.
You don't get like all calloused up and stuff, but
that's a great point.
Yeah.
So I have a question for some of me and my friends. Like, we kind of, I think jiu-jitsu drives people who, martial arts in general, like there's this like commonality between people who pursue that, right? And it's like, certain kind of personality types that want to increase their level of martial arts. But when you get older, it almost seems more daunting to go back. Like, I was lucky I started martial arts when I was like 5, 6, and this kind of kept going through my whole life.
And you didn't start in jiu-jitsu.
No, I never started in jiu-jitsu, but when I went to jiu-jitsu, it wasn't like, oh my God, this is like, what is this thing?
It's not foreign.
Yeah, it's like,
a martial art that is a little different.
Right? And even with my colleagues, I'll be, in the lounge talking to some of my colleagues, like, hey, you really need to try jiu-jitsu. They're like, oh no, I'm too old for that. Like, what do you say to someone who's like, too old, too out of shape, or
too small, too big?
Yeah, and then they look at these like, like that's UFC stuff, right? That's MMA stuff, like, and then like, how do you address those people? Because I know that you're very welcoming to all different types. I mean, you've trained me, so it's like, it's amazing, but.
So I think it's interesting because I see it all the time, and like we actually have 2 people who train here who are 2 of my good friends that one of them used to be coworkers, one is still a coworker, and they started because they just, we worked together and they heard that the gym was opening and they come train, and now they're here every week and they love it, and they're coming to train in Brazil and all this stuff. But now, like, initially they had those kind of reservations, like, I'm a little out of shape, I don't understand this, like, let me get in shape first, then I'll do it, right? And the way that I would kind of like compare it to someone is like, okay, like if I told you like, all right, like come running with me, right?
Right.
You wouldn't tell me like, hey, like let me go get in shape and then let's go to try to run a 2-hour marathon. Like this doesn't make any sense,
Yeah.
Like let's just go run slow miles until we run quicker miles. You know what I mean? And so I think, and then the other thing is, that's the analogy, but reality is jiu-jitsu is a really fun way, if you find that you enjoy it, to get in shape.
Right.
So saying like, okay, I'm going to go get in shape and then do jiu-jitsu, you're just kind of doing yourself a disservice, because like if you don't like to lift,
right,
well, go, roll around with your buddies and burn 1,000 calories.
Yeah, it's an insane amount of calorie burn.
You're gonna be terrible forever, but fine. Like okay, it's fun. I get to hang out. I did a great workout, and most of the time I was so worried about like, getting off my back that I didn't even think I was doing a workout. You know what I mean? And so
and your core gets activated, your muscles, your upper and lower body.
You're more exhausted than you've ever been, and that's a good thing, I think.
Shoot, I give up during the warm-up half the time. It's like, so, but that kind of brings me to the second part of it is like the older you get, the less you can tolerate any injury, right? Mm-hmm. Like, and a lot of like the kind of hesitation people have is, hey, I want to do jiu-jitsu, I want to do this stuff. I did a couple classes, but I'm scared of getting injured. Sure. Or like I twisted my foot a different way. And I always try to tell people like, hey, you're the same person that tore their ACL skiing last year, right? Or like you went and or you were like riding your bike and you fell down and broke your sternum, or your collarbone, sorry. So in jiu-jitsu, like how do you offset that? Like, hey, like to your students and say, look, like injuries can happen, but I mean, is the incidence really that much higher in jiu-jitsu versus other sports?
Yeah, so I think, the first thing is like you try to educate like folks, hey, luckily jiu-jitsu is one of, if not the only sport where you can do it at full speed, and if everything goes right, no one gets hurt.
Wow,
right?
Okay, yeah.
Whereas every other sport, you can't really say that.
Yeah.
Right?
It's true.
Definitely can't say that for the striking arts. Yeah. Right? You can't go full speed. Because if everything goes right for one person, the other person is knocked out.
Right.
And even for like mountain biking, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's true.
Even everything goes right. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, as instructors and you as a gym owner, I think you just try to do a good job of understanding that the experience will be different for everybody. And so like the examples like our Wednesday no-gi class, right? It's a mostly positional and live sparring class.
Right.
And I get folks all the time who come in for a first jiu-jitsu class, and it's a positional and live sparring class, which can sound intimidating.
Right.
But what I say to them instead is, hey, here's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna show you the position that we're doing, right? And your goal is boiled down to like the simplest thing I can think of. As an example, get your back off the mat, right?
Interesting.
And if you're ever uncomfortable, you tap.
Yeah.
And you try to design the drills in such a way that 2 black belts can go really hard and have a good training session, but I can also go with someone who's day one, and it'll be fine, And
I think you mentioned something that was very important, and I think that's for our listeners and for our members and everybody else is tap, right? It's like tap. You gotta tap, Jesus, right? It's like if there's no ego, right? Yeah. Ego is what injures you.
Yeah.
Like overtraining and ego. I think 100%. You combine those and you have like a high probability of injury.
It's
like I have zero ego. Somebody gets me, I know.
No problem.
There's a friend of mine that we roll with a lot. He's a wrestler, and Sam, and I swear, like there'll be times where I know I could probably get out of it, but I'm just gonna tap because there's no way I'm gonna sit there. And, I gotta work, It's like, and so it's very important, I think, for people to understand that you have a good environment, good gym, and that kind of brings me to that point. Well, you tap early if if you're worried about it. That's up to you. I want to get your thoughts on that, and also. How do you decide which jiu-jitsu gym or what MMA gym you're going to go into?
Yeah. So on the tap point, I think 100%. And like to add to that, having to tap is a big part of what's valuable in jiu-jitsu. Because like how often in life do you have to be like, hey, I give up. Like I don't, like I quit.
Yeah.
And I quit in the sense like I'm still going to go again now.
Right.
But I give up. Like that's a big lesson because you're boiling down to like, hey, like I failed the task, and now we've got to try to improve. And then it just prevents injury, And I try to tell the students, and it's funny, it happens in reverse for me, like, I work on bad positions and escapes and whatever, and I get situations where like, someone's deep on a submission and I'm trying to work my escape, and they're sort of like afraid to apply pressure, and they're like, and I'm like, hey, I will tap. Like, you apply your pressure, don't worry. Because they're thinking like, oh man, this guy must have that ego of like, he's not gonna tap. Like, no. 100% I'll tap. You know what I mean? Because that's the best part. Like I get to be like, no, and
then reset and go again.
And then we just go again.
And that's kind of what I all these kind of inspirational videos and podcasts. This is a personal kind of me on my pedestal right now. Is everybody tells you that you should never accept failure, right? It's like you should, never quit.
Sure.
How many times have you heard motivational speeches be
Yeah.
like, never quit. If
Stand
you're
up 6
dying,
times,
keep
get up
dying.
13.
You're like, it's like, keep running. Your feet fall off, keep
Right.
running. It's like, but true success happens when you learn from failure by accepting the failure, right? And so it's like any time that I would fail, I would learn, okay, well, you know what? I need to get to here. So I failed, let me learn from this, go again. And I think that's what, I'm assuming that's what you're trying to say is like, hey, if you tap, you're not like saying, I quit, I'm not doing jiu-jitsu. It's like, I tapped, why did I tap? What happened? How can I learn that this doesn't happen again?
Yeah.
And that translates into kind of like a success resilience.
This is a little trite, but I think it can still be true is, to your point, accepting failure, right? Like, accepting failure, like somebody got me in an armbar, is a trivial thing.
Yeah.
Life will go on.
Right.
But you can extrapolate that, right? And one of the things that jiu-jitsu like forces you to confront is the fact that like, I am incapable of doing this thing, right?
It's huge.
Man, woman, child, big, small, whatever. Like,
huge.
The funny one is like, if you tell someone who is 2 months into jiu-jitsu, someone who's never trained, similar size athleticism, you put one of them on bottom, you say, stand up, and the other one's gonna try to keep you down.
Yeah.
Which seems like an easy thing.
Right.
You are incapable.
That's
right?
insane. Yeah.
Whereas, like, let's say as an example, I get into a car accident because I crashed. That's a failure of somebody, say it was my fault. I never have to sit down and be like, how do I become a better driver? Right. Why did I do that?
Right.
Or like, hey, I never have a successful conversation with my significant other.
Right.
Right?
That's a great
That's
point.
a failure on somebody.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think jiu-jitsu, for people who do it correctly and use it as a path to better themselves, they get that lesson, They're like, I failed at this. This is a skill issue.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, I need to get better. And so,
I mean, if the humility that jiu-jitsu gives you and the sense of, self-improvement, that really kind of drives, I mean, for me, that's been a huge thing for me, just pulling out of, dark places. It's been like, you know what? I'm going to come back. And my brother's is going to be there and he's going to be like, hey, let's roll again.
And there's something very real about the fact that it's with another person. That's often a good friend. We're great friends. We train all the time. We roll.
Yeah.
And you have somebody your same size, same skill level, and you're like, man, he did something that it was just better.
Yeah.
So let's figure it out. And then you'll literally ask the same guy. You're
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
How did you do that? And he'll tell you every time.
You like smile afterwards, like,
He's
hey
not
man,
gonna
how'd you
hide
do
it,
that? Yeah,
He's not
it's
gonna-
like
there's no secrets,
Yeah,
He's not
no,
gonna be
it's awesome.
Not going to give you the stock to invest in. He'll tell you,
So I have this one question because when I came to Atlanta, when I was training and I had to find a gym.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the gyms I went into were extremely intimidating. Even though I was in martial arts my whole life, like I never went to a point where I was like highly competitive as you. This is something that I did. I'm like a super hobbyist, right? Like this is my thing that I do. I don't play golf. Like I just like martial arts, right?
Yeah, yeah.
How do you educate people like myself or others, like, hey, which gym should you go to? Like when you're searching, like what do you type in Google? Like, I don't want a jackass gym. I was like,
yeah. How is it not a bunch of douchebags? I mean, so I think when you walk through the door, I think there's a couple things that you try to look out for, right? And a couple things that you want. This is like any gym. So like I think one, clean, good facility, like that's, you can see where we're sitting, right? Like that's the standard. It should be clean. It should be welcoming. There should be like a place to sit.
Yeah,
they should have like water, like basic things like that, because they don't care about their facility. They're probably not going to care about their students. That's pretty straightforward. And then when you think about, you start to take a class and you take a practice class, a couple of things, right? Like what kind of folks are in the class? Do I have like a 40-year-old attorney, a 15-year-old who wants to compete? Do I have a girl who's 100 pounds? I have a guy who's 300 who played in the NFL. So I have a variety of people. So all these different people of differing opinions and backgrounds, they're like, oh, I can be here and be okay,
Right, right.
And then one thing maybe specific to jiu-jitsu that I think is important is beware of extreme structure.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What I mean by that is like, we have my class starts at 6:30, right? And folks will come in late. And it's honestly like a little embarrassing that we have to have the interaction where people will come and be like, hey, like, I'm so sorry. And they're like, 3.5 minutes late. And I'm like, man, don't ever say sorry. Like, you have 4 kids, a job, 9 mortgages. Like, you know what I mean?
9 mortgages,
like, You have life, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so, like, that extreme structure of like, hey, man, like, you can't take my class because you're 5 minutes. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
that kind of thing. Make sure the instructors, the owners, the front desk people are treating clients like clients because you are a client. You know what I
Right.
mean? And if you go to Starbucks and they treat you like shit, you're like, I'm not going to Starbucks anymore. You know what I mean?
Right.
So like, make sure you're being treated well. And
Right.
then from there, you're gonna have a decent experience. You know?
I do feel like, because I in my profession, punctuality is professionalism.
Sure.
So I do think that I agree with you about having that leeway.
Yep.
But where do you draw the line?
Yeah. Here's where I draw the line. So if you come in and you're like, hey, jiu-jitsu is a workout for me. I love this thing, but I can only make it at 6:45. Your class starts at 6:30, right? Okay, no problem. Show up whenever you can. Do your best to warm up on the side and jump in.
Right.
Right? Here's where I get a little annoyed, and this happens all the time. And I'll say it, and people can be like, "He's talking about me." I don't care. They'll come in 30 minutes late to an hour class.
Oh my
Be
God.
like, I want to be world champion, and I'm like, fantastic. But no, you don't.
Yeah.
Right? You don't want to be world champion.
Right.
Because you're missing 50% of the class.
Right.
And so if your actions aren't aligned with your objectives, I'm just not going to care. And
If your actions
Yeah.
aren't aligned
Yeah.
with your objectives.
yeah,
I love that.
And I'm not even going
Yeah.
to give you shit because
Yeah.
it's like you'll fail on your own and like whatever. Come in 30 minutes
Yeah.
late, but you won't be world champion. And you're not going to get special attention. Right?
Right.
Because why would I take away from the guy who like wants to get a good workout for your dream that you're not trying to fill? You know what I mean? Like,
that you're hoping that just happens.
right. Whereas like,
Yeah.
all right, show up 15 minutes early, like ask questions. Oh yeah. Like let's hang out after class and talk technique. No problem.
And that breeds that entitlement too. Like, hey,
Right.
it's a huge problem that
yeah.
we're seeing, is that level of entitlement.
Like you owe me time
because I want to be
right.
this and I'll be world champion
Right.
and this. That's
And it's like,
that's
how about my time?
Yeah,
Like-
we're gonna have an entire episode
Yeah, yeah.
devoted to entitlement.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that concludes our, make sure you like and subscribe. This Professor Ernesto Rivera teaches at American Top Team Sandy Springs on Mondays and Wednesdays, and Fridays, we believe, at 6:30. So, come check him out. Thank you guys so much.
Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching.
Thanks, Abby.
Thanks, bro.
Yeah, man.
Yeah.